Locked away for decades, some waiting for an execution that may never come, others proven innocent only after half a lifetime lost. These are America's forgotten death rows, where justice, politics, and human suffering collide. Tonight, we step inside the cells, the courtrooms, and the lives caught in limbo, exposing haunting stories the system would rather you forget. When people think of death row, they often imagine swift executions, justice delivered with finality. But in reality, America's death rows are less about executions and more about endless waiting. The United States still maintains death rows in more than 24 states, yet executions have slowed to a trickle. Since the year 2000, both public support and legal battles have steadily eroded the machinery of death. Still, thousands remain confined under sentences that hang over them like a permanent storm cloud. In California, the contradiction is glaring. At San Quentin State Prison, the nation's largest death row holds more than 600 men in limbo. The state has not carried out an execution since 2006, but the condemned still live in a unique isolation wing, rows of barred cages stacked 3 tiers high. Former Governor Gavin Newsom declared a moratorium in 2019, calling the death penalty irreversible and unjust. Yet the sentences remain in place. These inmates are not free, not executed, but trapped in a purgatory that can stretch decades. Archival fact. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, the average time between sentencing and execution in the U.S. is now more than 20 years. For many, the wait is even longer. Appeals move slowly through overburdened courts, while legal challenges test everything from DNA evidence to racial bias in jury selection. For prisoners, every denied appeal means more years in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day inside a concrete cell with little more than a narrow slit of sunlight. One such haunting case is Anthony Ray Hinton. Arrested in Alabama in 1985, Hinton was convicted of 2 murders based largely on faulty ballistics evidence. He spent nearly 30 years on death row before the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously overturned his conviction in 2015. Hinton later recalled that in those decades, he watched dozens of men walk past his cell toward the execution chamber, some guilty, some later found innocent. "The state took my 30s, my 40s, my 50s, he said. They can never give that back. For those still inside, hope is fragile. Some inmates cling to religion, others to the possibility of exoneration through new evidence or advocacy. Yet many die of natural causes before the state ever sets an execution date. In California alone, more than 100 death row prisoners have died awaiting execution since the moratorium began. Their deaths are unceremonious. No last words, no final meal, just the slow decay of forgotten men behind thick walls. Narrator, somber. This limbo, death before dying, is the hidden reality of America's death rows. In the chapters ahead, we'll uncover not just statistics, but human stories. Men wrongfully condemned, prison conditions that break the mind, and the larger question haunting a nation: why keep sentencing people to death in a system that no longer carries it out? Step inside a death row cell. 8 feet long, 6 feet wide. Concrete walls, a narrow steel bunk, a stainless steel combination sink and toilet. The door is heavy steel with a small rectangular slot, through which food trays are passed, shackles are applied, and the outside world is reduced to a single opening. For the men and women on death row, this is home for decades. Unlike general prison populations, death row inmates are subject to extreme restrictions. In California's San Quentin, in Texas's Palunsky Unit, and in Florida State Prison, condemned prisoners live in what advocates describe as solitary confinement by design. For most, it means 23 hours a day inside the cell. Exercise, when granted, happens alone, sometimes in a small caged yard, sometimes in an outdoor pen resembling a dog kennel. Human contact is minimal. Conversations with neighboring cells are shouted through thick walls and steel doors. Archival fact. The American Psychiatric Association has warned that prolonged solitary confinement causes depression, hallucinations, and irreversible psychological damage. On death row, these effects are magnified by the knowledge that one's life hangs in balance, whether the state executes you or the courts keep you waiting for decades. Prisoners and psychologists alike call it a death before death. Inside these cells, small acts take on oversized meaning. Some prisoners write thousands of letters to family or pen memoirs that later become books. Others create artwork, drawings made with pen ink, handmade chess pieces carved from soap, or elaborate origami folded from commissary receipts. These expressions are lifelines in a place designed to erase individuality. Yet not everyone endures. Suicide rates on death row are significantly higher than in general prison populations. In Texas, several inmates have taken their own lives rather than continue the endless waiting. Guards, often hardened by routine, describe discovering lifeless bodies hanging from improvised nooses made of bedsheets. "It's death row either way," one officer said. "Some just choose to go first." The monotony is broken only by rare events, legal visits, court hearings, or, most dreaded of all, the day a guard walks up and says, "Pack your property, for so." Me, it means transfer for an appeal hearing. For others, it means the end has arrived. Even then, uncertainty looms. In recent decades, last-minute stays of execution have become almost routine. Inmates are sometimes strapped to the gurney when word arrives that a court has delayed their death. The process begins again. Limbo extended. Imagine years measured not in birthdays or holidays, but in appeal deadlines and court rulings. Imagine never knowing if the next sunrise brings freedom, death, or another 10 years in the same 6x8 cage. For America's death row prisoners, this is not imagination. It is reality. In the next chapter, we'll uncover individual stories, men who maintained their innocence to the very end, some exonerated after decades, others executed despite serious doubts. These stories reveal not only the flaws of the system, but the human cost of waiting in the shadow of death. Behind the statistics of death row lie names, faces, and stories that refuse to be forgotten. Some of the most haunting are not of the guilty, but of the innocent. People sentenced to die for crimes they did not commit. Take Anthony Ray Hinton, whose story we touched on earlier. For nearly 30 years in Alabama's Holman Correctional Facility, Hinton lived in a cell barely large enough to stretch his arms. His conviction was based on ballistic evidence later proven unreliable. He survived 3 decades watching others walk to their deaths, knowing he was innocent. When he was finally exonerated in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that he should never have been convicted in the first place. Hinton later described death row as a coffin you live in before the grave. But not all such stories end in freedom. Cameron Todd Willingham, executed in Texas in 2004, maintained his innocence until the very end. He was convicted of setting a fire that killed his 3 children. At trial, state fire investigators testified the blaze showed signs of arson. Years later, independent experts concluded the science was flawed. What prosecutors called arson was likely an accidental fire. Yet Willingham was executed by lethal injection, his final words insisting on his innocence. His case remains one of the most controversial examples of possible wrongful execution in modern American history. Archival fact: since 1973, more than 195 people have been exonerated and released from death row in the United States. That's nearly 1 exoneration for every 9 executions carried out. In other words, for every 9 people executed, 1 has later been proven innocent. Advocates argue no other part of the justice system would tolerate such an error rate when human life is at stake. These cases take a heavy toll on the families involved. Loved ones of the condemned endure years of court dates, appeals, and prison visits, only to sometimes discover, decades later, that their son, brother, or father was innocent all along. Mothers have watched their sons executed, only to see their convictions overturned posthumously. For families of victims, the endless legal process can reopen wounds over and over, sometimes leaving them without closure for decades. Then, there are the last words. On death row, executions are often accompanied by final statements. Some apologize, some proclaim innocence, others offer forgiveness. The words of Troy Davis, executed in Georgia in 2011, despite widespread international protests and recantations from key witnesses, remain chilling. "I am innocent. All I can ask is that you dig deeper into this case so you can really find the truth. The stories of Hinton, Willingham, and Davis highlight the deepest fear surrounding the death penalty. Not simply cruelty, but the possibility of executing the innocent. For those still waiting in cells across the country, these haunting examples cast a permanent shadow. Each denied appeal carries not only the weight of guilt, but the possibility of a grave mistake that cannot be undone. In the next chapter, we will step inside America's most notorious death row, San Quentin, where more than 600 men remain under sentence of death despite a state moratorium. Their daily existence offers a glimpse into the contradictions of a justice system that condemns people to die, but rarely follows through. Perched on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, San Quentin State Prison is both iconic and infamous. Built in 1852, it has long been the most recognized prison in California. But behind its looming gates lies a unit unlike any other in the nation, the largest death row in the United States. More than 600 men are confined here under sentences of death, yet none have been executed since 2006. The contradictions are striking. California juries continue to hand down death sentences, yet the state itself has halted executions. Former Governor Gavin Newsom declared a moratorium in 2019, dismantling the execution chamber and calling the system irreversible and unjust. Still, the condemned remain confined in special housing units, where their lives play out in a limbo between life imprisonment and death. Archival fact: California's death row population is larger than those of Texas, Florida, and Alabama combined. If San Quentin's condemned were housed together as a separate prison, they would form a facility bigger than most state penitentiaries. Inside the East Block, where most death row prisoners live, the atmosphere is unlike general population yards. Cells stack 3 tiers high, facing narrow walkways patrolled by guards. Lights buzz overhead, and the clang of steel echoes throughout the tier. Prisoners spend almost all their time inside their cells, with only occasional exercise in outdoor cages known as yard pens. These pens are little more than concrete runs with high fencing and razor wire above, offering a brief glimpse of open sky. For years, San Quentin's death row was plagued by overcrowding and inadequate mental health care. Lawsuits forced reforms, but the conditions remain harsh. A 2015 report from California's own Inspector General described prisoners living in prolonged, isolating, and deteriorating circumstances. Even access to legal resources was so limited that courts intervened. Yet despite this, San Quentin's death row has developed its own culture. Inmates communicate by fishing, tying notes to long lines and sliding them between cells. Some publish essays through advocacy groups, sharing glimpses of their daily lives with the outside world. Others mentor younger inmates, aware that decades of waiting have made them unwilling experts in survival under sentence of death. Perhaps most haunting is the contradiction visible to any visitor. Just beyond the death row unit, San Quentin is also home to rehabilitation programs praised nationwide, college courses, journalism workshops, and even artistic projects. But for the men inside East Block, none of these opportunities are available. Their sentence, death, someday, somehow, excludes them from everything but waiting. Archival fact: more than 100 men on California's death row have died of natural causes or suicide since the last execution in 2006. In effect, death row has become a prison hospital for aging inmates, many of whom will never face the executioner, but will still die behind the same walls. San Quentin embodies the paradox of America's modern death penalty, a system that continues to sentence people to death while increasingly reluctant to carry out executions. For the condemned, it is the cruelest form of limbo, years of waiting in cages, haunted by the promise of an end that may never come. In the next chapter, we turn to the southern states, Texas, Florida, and Alabama, where executions are still carried out at a steady pace. Here, the machinery of death moves faster, but not without its own share of controversy, error, and haunting last words. If California represents delay and limbo, the southern states represent America's execution belt. Texas, Florida, and Alabama together account for the majority of executions carried out in the past 2 decades. In Texas, the Polunsky unit houses death row prisoners in solitary confinement, until their final transfer to Huntsville, where the state's lethal injection chamber operates. Since 1976, Texas has executed more than 580 people, more than any other state by far. Florida follows closely, maintaining one of the most active death rows in the country. Alabama, notorious for its use of nitrogen gas in recent years, has drawn international scrutiny for what human rights advocates call experimental executions. Yet even here, controversy remains. From botched injections to last-minute stays, these states expose the same contradictions. The machinery of death grinds on, but with uneven application, racial disparities, and continued risk of error. In one part of the nation, the condemned die waiting. In another, the condemned die quickly. But across both, the haunting question remains. Does the death penalty deliver justice, or just more suffering? Tonight, we've walked the tiers of San Quentin, heard the final words of the condemned, and seen the faces of the innocent who lost decades to a system that could not return their time. America's death rows are not relics of history. They are cages filled with men and women still waiting, still suffering, still forgotten. As executions decline and moratoriums spread, the nation is left with a haunting contradiction. Why maintain death rows at all if justice is no longer carried out? For the prisoners, the victims' families, and society itself, the answers remain painful and unresolved. Because on death row in America, the punishment is not only death, it is the decades of dying that come before.